first subcommittee hearing of the 112th Congress. I would like to commend Mr. Langevin on his leadership for the 111th Congress and congratulate Ms. Sanchez on our selection as our new ranking member. I'd also like to welcome our new members on the subcommittee, Mo Brooks, John Fleming, John Garamendi, Scott Riggle, Dutch Ruppersberger, Austin Scott, and Betty Sutton. Glad to have another Ohioan on the subcommittee. Since we organized at the end of January, our subcommittee has conducted several overview briefings on various aspects of the Strategic Forces portfolio. Just yesterday, officials from OSD Policy and U.S. Strategic Command briefed members on the administration's nuclear policy and posture. Today's hearing provides our subcommittee with the opportunity to review the status of U.S. forces, U.S. strategic forces. Since last year's strategic posture hearing, a number of notable events have occurred and several new policy documents have been released that affect our nation's strategic posture and which ultimately frame the administration's fiscal year 2012 budget request. We will hear from four distinguished witnesses. In our first panel, we are joined by General Bob Kaler, the new commander of U.S. Strategic Command, and Dr. Jim Miller, Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. I believe the committee's oversight is further enhanced through additional perspectives outside of the traditional Department of Defense witnesses we usually hear from. Therefore, I asked Dr. Bill Perry and Dr. Jim Schlesinger, the Chairman and Vice Chairman of the U.S. Strategic Posture Commission, to provide their views on our nation's strategic posture and the changes that have occurred in the last few years. Dr. Schlesinger was unable to join us today. Our thoughts are with him, and I appreciate Dr. Keith Payne filling in for him. I want to thank each of our witnesses for appearing today and thank them for their service and leadership. I will keep my comments brief to allow ample time for members to ask questions. However, I would like to highlight four areas of concern, and I hope our witnesses will address these issues here today. First, the ink is barely dry on the New START treaty, and administration officials are already discussing further nuclear force reductions. The assumption appears to be that more arms control and deeper cuts to U.S. forces is desirable and puts us further down the path to a, quote, world free of nuclear weapons, close quote, a vision the President described in his 2009 Prague speech. We must be careful here. The President admitted in that same speech that this vision is unlikely to be realized in our lifetimes. We should slow down, let the treaty ink be dry, and reassess where we are. Our security requirements should guide the feasibility and desirability of further reductions, not the other way around. One reason for caution is uncertainty. None of us can predict the future. China is, quote, rapidly upgrading its nuclear capability and is trying to reach parity with Russia and the U.S., close quote. Russia would have us trade away our missile defenses, conventional forces, and space capabilities to secure another arms control treaty that reduces their tactical nuclear weapons. In the last few months, NATO has reaffirmed that nuclear deterrence is a core element of alliance security. In the last week, a senior South Korean official suggested the United States reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula for deterrence and assurance. There are long-term implications of a rush to reduce our nuclear forces that merit thoughtful consideration. Second, the Nuclear Posture Review and Section 1251 report made several promises with respect to the modernization of our nuclear warheads, delivery systems, and infrastructure. Based on what I have seen thus far for the fiscal year 12 budget request, I'm initially encouraged that the administration appears ready to honor these promises at last for the upcoming year. But there is much work to be done, and I remain concerned about the long-term commitment to these investments, a responsibility shared by both the administration and Congress. We have been handed the bill of deferred maintenance. We must ensure that these timelines are met and that these promises are kept. Third, I have seen solid progress in the administration's implementation of the phased adaptive approach, PAA, for missile defense in Europe, and a significant improvement in their engagement of Congress from where we were a year ago. This work is commendable. I met with NATO parliamentarians and NATO officials just last week and was pleased to see how far the missile defense discussion in Europe has advanced from just 3 years ago. Some of us remain concerned, however, about the Department's hedging strategy for defense of the homeland in case the long-range threat comes earlier or technical issues arise in the development of a new SM-3 interceptor. I came away from our PAA hearing last December believing that the Department's hedging strategy was hollow. I hope our witnesses can discuss the progress being made to add detail to the hedging strategy outlined in the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. Lastly, I would ask that our witnesses discuss what they see as the key challenges and opportunities in national security space. I'm particularly concerned about the health of our space industrial base and our export control policies and finding the right balance between protecting our national security interest and strengthening our industrial capacity. It goes without saying that these are challenging economic times, and I'm certainly committed to working with the Department to identify efficiencies and better ways of doing business. With that said, we are a nation fighting two wars, and it is our subcommittee's responsibility to ensure our strategic forces are kept viable in both the good years and the bad. Well, thank you again for being with us today, and I look forward to your testimony. And with that, let me turn to my ranking member, Ms. Sanchez, for her opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Chairman Turner. I look forward to working with you and all the members of our subcommittee, and I know that we can accomplish a lot this year. I'd also like to recognize and thank Mr. Langevin for his strong and his steady leadership on this subcommittee in the last Congress. And I want to join Mr. Turner in welcoming our witnesses to our first, this is our first, right? Our first Strategic Forces hearing of the 112th Congress. And we look forward to hearing from the General and from Dr. Miller to examine the strategic posture of the United States and our strategic forces, including our nuclear weapons programs, our missile defense systems, and our military space programs. I've already had an opportunity to meet with you, and I'm sorry, General, that you were a little delayed today and we didn't get a chance to talk, but I'm sure that we will get to talk privately about some of the issues that we might have. I'd also like to thank Dr. Perry and Dr. Payne, who provide their views in the context of the recommendations made by the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the U.S. And I'm also sorry that the Secretary could not join us today. In April 2009, President Obama committed to working towards a world free of nuclear weapons. And last year, the administration took several important steps to implement progress towards that long-term vision and to provide guidance with regard to our strategic forces. First, on the nuclear forces, the President announced its nuclear posture review in April last year, which outlined a plan to reduce the role and the number of nuclear weapons while committing to maintaining our nuclear deterrent to reliably defend our country and our allies. And so that blueprint addressed the most pressing threats, I think, to U.S. security, the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries and to terrorists. And I know I worked quite a few years now being on this committee in trying to move part of that forward. But I'm concerned that programs that underpin the maintenance of our nuclear deterrent and urgent non-proliferation efforts didn't receive fiscal year 11 requested level of funding in the House-passed continuing resolution. And I know that myself and some of my fellow Democratic colleagues submitted to Chairman Ryan a letter talking to him about the concerns of those cuts and stressing the importance of strengthening this country's nuclear threat reduction efforts, and especially with the work that's carried out at Lawrence, Livermore, Los Alamos, and Sandia National Laboratories. I think those are very important efforts in order to bring down the risk of nuclear terrorism, and I think it also helps us to maintain a strong deterrent. So I'm pleased that the administration in particular completed and that the Senate passed the New START treaty with Russia. I think that was, of course, one of the most important things that we had on our list. It's been able to reset, I think, our relations with Russia. You know, I have a lot more in my opening statement, Mr. Chairman, but I do know that votes are coming up, and so I'll submit the rest of it for the record, but I had already expressed to Dr. Miller yesterday some of my concerns and my questions, and I hope that I'll get to talk to the General too, and hopefully with our 5 minutes today we'll get more information out of the both of you. So thank you for being with us. And with that, I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. That certainly is very kind of you. Each of our witnesses will receive 5 minutes to give a summary of their opening statement. We'll then proceed for members' questions, and then we'll go to our second panel. The committee has received your full written statements, and without objection, those statements will be made part of the hearing record. We'll begin with General Kaler. The floor is yours.
Well, Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Sanchez, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present my views on United States Strategic Command's missions and priorities. I'm privileged and humbled to appear today for the first time as Commander of Strategic Command. I'm also pleased to appear with Dr. Jim Miller, a great colleague with whom I look forward to working in the coming years. Today's national security landscape is marked by protracted conflict, constant change, and enormous complexity. We are facing a significantly different operating environment than those we have experienced in the past, an operating environment that's characterized by extraordinary technological advances, rapid changes in the number and type of actors, and hybrid combinations of strategies, tactics, and weapons. Of the threats we face, weapons of mass destruction clearly represent the greatest threat to the American people, particularly when pursued or possessed by violent extremists or state proliferators. To deal with this environment demands faster, more comprehensive awareness, strategic thinking, flexible planning, decentralized execution, rapid innovation, and unprecedented information sharing. Our mission remains clear: to detect, deter, and prevent attacks against the United States, and to join with the other combatant commands to defend the nation should deterrence fail. STRATCOM's first priority is to deter nuclear attack on the United States and our allies. As we implement the New START Treaty, we are committed to maintaining a safe, secure, and ready nuclear deterrent. We're also the strongest possible advocates in favor of the investments that are needed to sustain and modernize the nuclear triad and the nuclear weapons complex that underpins it. While nuclear deterrence is our #1 priority, STRATCOM also has broader responsibilities in the 21st century. Ongoing operations demand our full commitment as well. So in partnership with the other combatant commands, our next priority is to improve our plans, procedures, and capabilities to address regional problems, especially where those problems and capabilities cross regional boundaries. STRATCOM's activities to synchronize plans and capabilities for missile defense, ISR, electronic warfare, and combating weapons of mass destruction are helping to bring unity of effort to regional operations and increased effectiveness to our overall investment. Another priority is to improve our capabilities and operating concepts in the important civil and national security areas of space and cyberspace. Space is increasingly contested, congested, and competitive, and its importance to the United States goes far beyond national security. Ensuring uninterrupted access to space and space-based capabilities, improving our awareness of objects and activities in space, and enhancing the protection and resilience of our most critical systems are all essential objectives. Achieving those objectives demands continued investment to improve space situational awareness and to sustain our critical space capabilities, while we also pursue increased opportunities with allies and commercial partners. Our greatest challenge in cyberspace is to improve our ability to operate and defend the DoD network at network speed, and to make our critical activities continue even in the face of adversary attempts to deny or disrupt them. STRATCOM and its subunified command, U.S. Cybercom, are working hard to improve our organizations and relationships, enhance network situational awareness and protection, increase our technical capacity, and develop the human capital we need as we look to the future. We have much to do, but we also know today's fiscal environment demands that we must maximize both mission effectiveness and taxpayer value. We will continue our efforts to identify every possible place where we can become more efficient as we work to become even more effective. Finally, we're committed to taking care of our warriors, our government civilians, and our families. To this end, we will fully support the efforts of the services to properly train, equip, support, and care for our men and women, and we will work diligently to ensure a safe and positive work environment. Mr. Chairman, great challenges lie ahead, but so do great opportunities. The men and women of STRATCOM perform their difficult mission with remarkable skill and dedication every minute of every day. I am proud to be associated with them and look forward to working with you and the committee as we address the important national security issues. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. O'Kelly, I want to apologize to you for all the conversation going on here, but I'm trying to do the logistics of our vote, and this is what I've come up with, and if this is acceptable, hopefully, to you guys, you gentlemen, I'm going to hand the gavel to Mr. Lamborn, who is going to preside while Dr. Miller gives his statement. Ms. Sanchez and I are going to go vote in return. During the period of the debate on the motion to recommit and the vote on the motion to recommit, we will ask our questions. Anybody else in the subcommittee is certainly welcome to return with us to hear the answers to those. We will then go and vote for the 2 votes that are remaining, and then when this subcommittee reconvenes, everyone will have their opportunity to ask their questions. So with that, I will be seeing you in a moment. Thank you.
Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Sanchez, as you depart, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this afternoon. It is a great pleasure to join the new commander of U.S. Strategic Command, General Bob Kaler. As Chairman Turner alluded to, just over a year ago, DoD submitted to Congress the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and soon thereafter the Nuclear Posture Review. And along with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, we recently submitted the first ever National Security Space Strategy to complete the congressional requirement for a Space Posture Review. My prepared statement summarizes the progress that we've made in each of these areas, and I'll just touch on the highlights in each area. On nuclear issues, the administration has made significant progress over the past year, including ratification and entry into force of the New START Treaty and an updated investment plan for nuclear modernization. A key contribution of the New START Treaty is its verification regime. The U.S. and Russia will exchange initial New START databases no later than March 22nd, and this information will help us to better track the status of Russian strategic offensive arms. The treaty, as you know, allows each side to conduct up to 18 on-site inspections per year. These inspections will begin after April 5th, and our inspectors are ready to go. DoD's fiscal year 2012 budget reflects our commitment to sustain and to modernize our strategic delivery systems, and is the front end of an investment of some $125 billion over the next 10 years. This includes sustaining the current Ohio-class submarines and continuing R&D on a replacement submarine, sustaining the Trident D5, the Trident II D5 missile, preparatory analysis for a follow-on ICBM capability to be fielded in the 2030 timeframe, developing a new dual-capable long-range standoff missile, upgrades to the B-2 to enhance its survivability and capabilities, and finally the development and fielding of a new long-range nuclear-capable penetrating bomber with funding starting in fiscal year 2012. As you know, the National Nuclear Security Administration, part of DOE, has proposed spending about $88 billion over the next 10 years to sustain our nuclear arsenal and to modernize infrastructure. The NPR identified a number of NNSA facilities that are decades old and must be upgraded or replaced to ensure the reliability of our nuclear arsenal. And as the committee is aware, and as Ranking Member Sanchez alluded to, the House proposed budget bill, H.R. 1, would cut NNSA funding in 2011 and fiscal year 2011 by about 10% from the President's request. Proposed cuts include over $600 million from the Nonproliferation Program, over $300 million from nuclear weapons activities, and over $100 million from nuclear naval reactors. If enacted, these cuts will delay needed investments, they'll drive up program costs, they will reduce our ability to engage in nonproliferation, and they'll set back our efforts to implement the Nuclear Posture Review. As we look to the future, conventional prompt global strike systems offer the possibility of being able to defeat time-urgent regional threats with rapidly executed high-precision attacks without having to use nuclear weapons. Such capabilities would increase the options available to the President. DoD is currently focusing in particular on conventionally armed long-range missile systems that would fly a non-ballistic trajectory, so-called boost glide systems. Such systems could steer around countries to avoid overflight and have flight trajectories clearly distinguishable from an ICBM or SLBM. And such systems would not be considered as to be, quote, new kinds of strategic offensive arms, end quote, for the purposes of the New START Treaty, and so not be accountable. DoD has proposed investing about $2 billion between now and 2016 for research and development of these types of systems. To turn now to missile defenses, as you know, the U.S. is currently protected against limited ICBM attacks with 30 ground-based interceptors at Fort Greely, Alaska, and Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. The President's FY12 request provides a substantial investment in the defense of our homeland to ensure it remains viable over the long term. As Mr. Turner alluded to, the United States must also be well hedged against the possibility of rapid threat developments or unexpected technical delays in U.S. missile defenses. The Department is in the process of finalizing and refining its hedging strategy, and I look forward to briefing this subcommittee on results soon at a classified level. Since the President's announcement of the European Phased Adaptive Approach in September 2009, the administration has made substantial progress on implementation. We are on track to deploy all 4 phases of the EPAA and on time. The USS Monterey, a guided missile cruiser equipped for ballistic missile defense, is due to depart next week on March 6th from its home port in Norfolk, Virginia, for a 6-month mission. And this is the start of Phase 1 of the EPAA. I want to say just a couple of words about missile defense cooperation with Russia. Our approach on this topic starts from our conviction that NATO must be responsible for defense of NATO territory, and Russia should be responsible for defense of Russian territory. Our concept is to operate our respective missile defense systems independently, but to cooperate by steps such as sharing sensor data to improve the ability of both systems to defeat missile attacks by regional actors such as Iran. As President Obama has stated, this cooperation can happen even as we have made clear that the system we intend to pursue with Russia will not be a joint system, and it will not in any way limit the United States or NATO's missile defense capabilities. U.S. space capabilities allow our military to see with clarity, communicate with certainty, navigate with accuracy, and operate with assurance. And to meet our requirements in space, DoD is requesting about $26 billion in fiscal year 2012. This includes $3.7 billion for satellite communications, $1.8 billion for missile warning, $1.7 billion for our GPS constellation, and a number of other investments. There are currently more than 22,000 trackable man-made objects in space of 10 centimeters or more, and many tens or hundreds of thousands of smaller objects, but potentially large enough to damage a satellite. And to deal with this increasing congestion of space, DoD is taking a number of steps. We're expanding sharing of space situational awareness data to increase transparency and cooperation. We're looking at how to transform the Joint Space Operations Center at Vandenberg, Air Force Base, California, into a combined space operations center operated with international partners. And the administration is currently closely evaluating the European Union's proposed International Code of Conduct for outer space activities as a potentially useful set of guidelines for safe activity in space. Finally, the United States is developing a range of capabilities, plans, and options to deter, defend against, and if necessary, defeat efforts to interfere with or attack U.S. or allied space systems. And I'd like to make clear that while U.S. responses to interference or attack on space systems must be proportional and in accordance with the law of armed conflict, our responses would not necessarily be limited to the space domain. So in conclusion, reducing strategic risk to the United States and sustaining key U.S. strategic capabilities are long-term challenges that will require support from a succession of administrations and Congresses. Success will clearly require developing and sustaining bipartisan consensus on key issues, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity today to continue that engagement, and we'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, and thank you, General Kaler, for your testimony. We know your time is very valuable, and so we thank you for your patience and flexibility while we go over and vote and then come back, because we do want to hear your responses to our questions. And so we will be in recess until Chairman Turner returns.
Well, thank you for your patience during votes. We're hoping to keep this efficient and moving. That's why we're doing this in shifts. And I appreciate you gentlemen giving us your patience. What we'll do is, the ranking member and myself, we will ask our questions. I think we should have about 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'll go for the next 2 votes and then return with the other members for the purposes of addressing additional questions, then turn to our second panel. I obviously have questions for both of you. Dr. Miller, I'm going to start with you. And in my opening statement, I made a broad construct of the issues that I'm concerned about, and I want to give you an opportunity to respond to those. I basically put them into 3 different categories for the purposes of this question. I am very concerned, I think, as are others, that the President's concept of a world without nuclear weapons or going to zero can be a pressure for driving policy instead of the real threat or deterrent assessment driving policy. Now, that's not to say that the concept of a world without nuclear weapons or the concept of zero is not something that we all would aspire to, and it's certainly not to say that there isn't room for the types of reductions that we have seen in New START or issues of trying to look to what is an appropriate shape of our strategic posture. But ensuring that those 2 things are disconnected, that we don't have the pressure of going to zero driving these issues, is a concern I think that many people have. We had New START, and the Senate made clear that as we looked to issues of further reductions, that we had to look to Russia's tactical nuclear weapons. One of the points that I made when we had our conversation is that when we have a review of our deterrence, we have to have a concept of what we are deterring. We cannot merely do an assessment of our posture without the concept of what are we deterring. That means that we have to both identify who those are, who it is that we are deterring, and what their assets are, and what is necessary for deterring it. I'm aware, as we have discussed, that NATO is also undertaking a deterrence review, and I have concerns there as well, that we not want a political deterrence review, but a real policy and substantive technical review of both the needs of NATO and the concepts of what exactly we are deterring. I'd like for you to talk about that for a moment on the issues of what are we trying to deter, how do we relate then that to our actual strategic posture, and how you see the deterrence review in NATO unfolding. Secondly, as I discussed in my opening statement, I'm very concerned about the concept of the hedge that was identified in the ballistic missile, the missile defense review, that in the phase adaptive approach, there was this concept that the 2-stage would be viewed as a hedge. We had a discussion in that in another hearing. I know you've had additional thoughts on that. I'd love to hear them today. I would also like your thoughts on what other reductions currently are you looking at from a policy perspective as we take up this issue, as we look at what currently is on the table. What do you see ahead of us? Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The President has talked in the past about the next step we intend to take on arms control, so let me start there. And what he's said, and what we stated in the NPR as well, was that we would look for a next bilateral round with Russia that would deal with both deployed and non-deployed nuclear weapons and both strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons. As you alluded to, there are not exactly symmetries in each of those categories, but overall there's an approximate parity, and it's a useful basis to think about conducting the next round of negotiations. In terms of the process that we'll undertake prior to starting those negotiations, step 1 is to do the hard look at our guidance and at the implications of the guidance that comes from the White House, that comes from the Secretary and the Chairman, that goes to General Kaler, and to understand the implications of any revisions in that guidance in terms of what's to be deterred by whom. As we conduct that work in parallel, we'll be thinking about what types of verification regimes would be appropriate for a negotiation or a future agreement that really addressed the full range of nuclear weapons, deployed, non-deployed, strategic, non-strategic, the implications for verification are significant and would likely go well beyond what we have in the New START treaty. Also in parallel, we need to be consulting with our allies, and part of that discussion will be in the context of the deterrence defense policy review of NATO that you alluded to. And that conversation, I think, is beginning, is underway, as you saw when you visited. And from our perspective, it's essential that we continue to stick by the principles that have guided NATO for many decades, including risk sharing and burden sharing, and our understanding that as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO should be a nuclear alliance, just as long as nuclear weapons exist, the United States will sustain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal. So these activities will be going on to some degree in parallel, but just as was the case with the nuclear posture review, where we reached key conclusions on what we needed for our nuclear posture and what in terms of numbers and diversity of the force and so on, and then took those results to give guidance to our negotiators. We similarly will get the guidance work done, the assessments done that I talked about for what's required for effective deterrence, including strategic stability, and in parallel deal with the other issues I alluded to, including verification, consultation with allies. We'll take the time to get it right. The timeline that was given by the Senate, as you know, sir, was a year from the Senate ratification for us to come back with a proposal for engaging Russia on tactical nuclear weapons in particular. With respect to the hedge, I paid attention at our December hearing, and message was well received that we had not at that point articulated sufficiently how the hedge will work, under what conditions it would be initiated, and what specific responses we would have. We have done a lot of work on it, and I have to report today that we're not quite there, and I'd like to come back and give a detailed classified briefing. I'd like to commit to do so in the next several weeks. Some of the potential triggers for invoking the hedge will involve classified information, and so I'd prefer to do that in a classified setting in any case. I can talk about the elements, but you're already familiar with those, including Missile Field 2, the 8 additional silos that are being completed. Missile Field 1, it's new for this year. We're now going to mothball Missile Field 1 rather than essentially eliminate it, which gives the opportunity for deployment of 6 more interceptors in future. And I understand that we need to explain in more detail and on a detailed timeline than we have the specific role of the 2-stage GBI. I can tell you it continues to have a critical role in the hedge, and I would just ask your indulgence for several more weeks to come back and give details in a classified setting.
Before I go to Dr. Kaler, just to General Kaler, just to restate and give you my concern, not necessarily for you to respond at this point, but I'm very concerned that as we begin the deterrence review, or as we begin any review to look at further reductions, that it be done in context of, as I was describing, the actual what is being deterred. You know, we have Russia, we have China, we have Iran, we have North Korea, and any concept of reducing, especially in Europe, the U.S. footprint or the nuclear footprint of NATO as a deterrence must take into consideration Russia and the over 5,000 tactical nuclear weapons that they have that are in the area, because, of course, NATO is looking to deter Russia. We are looking to deter Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. And I don't think anybody thinks that the current ratio between those tactical nuclear weapons in Russia and what we have as present with NATO is an appropriate ratio. They have overwhelming numbers, and I think the Senate's direction was address those numbers, get Russia to make a concession with respect to the tactical weapons, and we certainly don't want to see just unilateral reductions on the side of the United States without addressing what is that important issue of the threat of the tactical nuclear weapons. With respect to the hedge, of course, our continued concern is that with the phase adaptive approach, the coverage of protection to the mainland United States is not to arrive till 2020. That's in the best case of scenario on the evolution of technology. It is possible that the threat could evolve as early as some intelligence reports say as 2015. That would leave a significant gap to the United States, and so that's why I appreciate your continued work on the issue of the hedge. Joel Kaler, thank you so much for your continued thoughts and, of course, your leadership. One item that we had a discussion on was on the triad of looking to the Navy and the tube reductions of 20 to 16. It's continued discussion in other hearings on the Hill today. I would like your thoughts on the reduction of the tubes and what you see driving that, how you see it affecting our strategic posture, and any other thoughts you have on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first of all, sir, let me say that in my mind anyway, the discussion of a Trident, an Ohio-class replacement, is really a discussion in the context of the need to modernize the entire triad. And so, first of all, I think that it's important for us to recognize that that is one piece, an important piece, but a piece of the decision process that we need to go through. Second, the issue of the number of tubes is not a simple black and white answer. So let me just comment here for a minute. First of all, the issue in my mind is the overall number of tubes we wind up with at the end, not so much the number of tubes per submarine. Second, the issue is, of course, we have flexibility and options with how many warheads per missile per tube. So that's another consideration that enters into this mixture. Another consideration that is important to me is the overall number of boats and the operational flexibility that we have with the overall number of boats, given that some number will need to be in maintenance, some number will need to be in training, et cetera. And so those and many other factors, to include a little bit of foresight here in looking ahead to 20 years from now, an anti-submarine warfare environment that the Navy will have to operate in. All of those bear on the ultimate size, weight, shape, configuration of a follow-on to the Ohio. At this point, Mr. Chairman, I am not overly troubled by going to 16 tubes. As I look at this, given that we have that kind of flexibility that I just laid out, given that this is an element of the triad, and given that we have some decision space here as we go forward to decide on the ultimate number of submarines, nothing troubles me operationally here to the extent that I would oppose a submarine with 16 tubes. I understand the reasons for wanting to have 20. I understand the arguments that were made ahead of me. But as I sit here today, given the totality of the discussion, I am, as I say, I'm not overly troubled by 16. Now, I don't know that the gavel has been pounded on the other side of the river yet with a final decision, but at this point, I am not overly troubled by 16.
20 tubes met Stratcom's strategic requirements?
Yes, sir.
Our troubling aspect that we have is if 20 met the requirements, now we're looking at 16. Does 16 meet the requirements? And how was it determined that 20 to 16 meets the requirements?
Well, I can't comment on sort of the acquisition decisions that went on in the background. I don't know what those decisions were. But the difference between 20 and 16, there was also a different number of boats in play. And so the overall difference, as I went back and looked at this, was not that significant in terms of tubes.
So you're saying 16 will meet Stratcom's requirements? 16
will meet Stratcom's requirements. Given that we are sitting here, 20 years in advance, it certainly will meet our operational requirements given the size of the tube, the performance of the D5, the ability to upload the weapons, because at the end of the day here, the question is, will we be able to deliver sufficient weapons with the platforms that are available, and in that, this would meet our requirements, just depending on the weapon upload.
And we look forward to that, reviewing the analysis that says that the difference is sufficient.
Yes, sir.
General. Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General. Thank you, Doctor, for being before us. I'm going to be going to South Korea in a few weeks, and so I'm sure I'm going to be asked a lot of questions. A South Korean press report this week indicated that National Security Council, WMD czar, Dr. Gary Smorer, left open the possibility that the U.S. might introduce tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula if South Korea made such a request. The NSC deputy spokesman clarified it afterwards to say that our policy remains to support a non-nuclear Korean peninsula and that there was no plan to change that policy, that tactical weapons are not necessary for the defense of South Korea, and that we have no plan or intention to return them. Would you clarify what our policy is with regard to forward-based tactical nuclear weapons, and is the administration planning on increasing the number of deployed tactical nuclear weapons?
Ma'am, the policy of the administration is to continue to have the ability to forward deploy both tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons in the form of fighter aircraft, dual capable aircraft, and in the form of bombers. With respect to Korea, the clarification of the statement is exactly right. Our policy remains to support a non-nuclear Korean peninsula, and the other elements that you discussed were exactly right as well. What I would like to add, and this is based on past and ongoing conversations with our South Korean allies, is that the U.S. nuclear umbrella remains firmly over South Korea, and neither side believes that on-peninsula deployments are necessary to sustain that deterrent.
Thank you, Doctor. As I stated in my opening comments, that New START was what I believe is a real change and a re-engagement, if you will, with Russia. I asked you this yesterday, Doctor, but maybe for the record, and General, if you have any comments, where do you see us making further progress with the Russians and with respect to arms reduction, and also with respect to missile defense, considering, at least in the times that I've been over there in recent years, they've been very anxious about our whole issue with respect to missile defense, even with the phased approach that we have come. Again, I understand the phased approach was not in because of how they view this, but can you talk a little bit about this engagement in Russia, and what are the positives? Where do you see us going, and what we could do as Congress people who work on these subjects to enhance that relationship?
Let me take a cut and see if General Kaler wants to come in as well. In addition to the internal planning that we're doing currently to think about future steps on arms control with respect to Russia and all the elements that I described in responding to Chairman Turner, under the auspices of the Tauscher-Ryabkov group, headed by, on our side, by Undersecretary of State Ellen Tauscher, we are initiating discussions on the future basis of strategic stability. These talks are just getting, discussions are just getting underway. We don't expect them to result in a negotiated agreement, but what we do want to engage the Russians on is what do things look, not just in the 2010s and so on, but in the 2020s and forward, and what will be the basis of deterrence in the future. They clearly have expressed concerns about the future course of our missile defense deployments, and we have, in all venues, come back with a clear statement that we will not accept any limitations quantitatively, qualitatively, geographically, or otherwise. And so this is part of a conversation about how to sustain strategic stability over the long term. And I think it's an important conversation both with Russia and with different qualitatively and quantitatively, but also very important with China. We've not yet had the same sort of positive response in terms of willingness to have this discussion vis-a-vis China, and we continue to ask for that. On missile defense cooperation, as I said in my statement, we have made clear that we don't see moving forward with a joint system, but see moving forward with the possibility of cooperation on separate systems. And with respect to NATO, our concept is that NATO would defend NATO, Russia would defend Russia, and we would look for opportunities to cooperate that would be mutually beneficial. The Bush administration first proposed the possible use of radar data from 2 Russian radars, one at Armavir, one at Gabala. We've looked at those and a couple of others as well, and we think that, in fact, some early warning data from those radars could potentially improve the ability of our phase-adaptive approach to intercept missiles aimed at Europe. It's also possible that sensors from the United States and from our NATO allies could improve the ability of Russia to engage a missile headed towards it from Iran. And so sharing of sensor data, I think, is the most promising initial area. In principle, it's possible that one side could intercept a missile that's headed for the other. If you look at the geography of a launch from Iran or elsewhere, for that matter, in the Middle East, there are some trajectories that head towards Europe that pass over Russia, and some that would, and some conversely, that would pass over Europe on its way to Russia. So we will look to engage with them on those issues, and a foundational activity that we've proposed is to do a joint analysis that looks at the architectures and how each side's sensors and so forth could assist in the ability of the other side to conduct missile defense intercepts. Our next meeting with them, I will co-chair in just a couple of weeks, and we'll look to move the ball forward on these issues. We think it's in both U.S. and Russian interest to have some real cooperation in this area.
Thank you. General, do you have anything to add?
Congresswoman Sanchez, I do. I would just add that over the years, since the end of the Cold War in particular, but even prior to that, we have found that there is extraordinary value in having military-to-military contact with the Russians at all levels on lots of issues. We find that those engagements typically lead to better understanding. They lead to less confusion at some times. And, you know, as we look to the future, we see a lot of opportunities here that we might be able to engage more with the Russians at a mill-to-mill level on a wide variety of issues. In addition, as Dr. Miller said, there have been some initiatives. You know, the Secretary of Defense visited China recently, and similarly, you know, we see some value there in military-to-military contact.
Thank you. Because of the time constraint, I'm going to hold on to my questions, and maybe we'll allow the chance for the others to ask, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you so much. We're going to adjourn. Before we do, I do have one issue I want to clarify first, and with respect to the questions I was asking. It is my understanding that the NATO Deterrence Review could recommend a reduction in the U.S. Nuclear weapons that are in Europe, and I want to make certain I'm not walking away with a misunderstanding on that. The gentleman at this time would correct me if I'm mistaken. And then coupled with that, my concern being, I would expect, I think the Senate's direction would expect that if that were to occur, that it be done in conjunction with a concession or reduction overall in the Russian tactical nuclear weapons. Gentlemen?
Chairman Turner, I would not want to prejudge what the outcome of the review would be. We have views, obviously, within the administration about its future direction and both its focus and desired outcomes. But
you would not disagree that it could recommend reductions?
I will, yes.
Okay. And then ergo to my statement of, and I would hope that that would occur within the context of reductions and concessions in tactical nuclear weapons from Russia. Gentlemen, with that, we're going to adjourn for these two votes, and then we'll be returning for the questions from the other members. Thank you.
Energy, of course, some more continues in terms of directed energy and missile defense efforts. That has been curtailed significantly, but we have some interest in what's residual in that activity. Regarding hypersonics, of course, we also have development efforts underway for what we are calling conventional prompt global strike. And there is some promising work that has gone on and more to do that would perhaps give us a real advantage here in small numbers for specific targets to give to the President some options to go after some kinds of targets conventionally that we do not have that option today. And so both of those are very promising to us from those two standpoints. Sir.
If I could just add very briefly, as I mentioned before, the Department is spending about $2 billion over the next 5 years on the hypersonics, in particular on the conventional prompt global strike boost glide vehicle. And we do see a lot of promise there from a policy and operational perspective. With respect to lasers, with the conclusion that the airborne laser didn't have real operational utility given its limitations, it and other activities went together into a laser R&D program that is $100 million a year plus. And there are a number of promising technologies across a range of applications, including missile defense and others. If I could add just very quickly on the earlier question, and I apologize for doing this, but I just wanted to add to General Kaler's answer on cyber that in addition to having the authority to protect its own networks, the Defense Department is assigned responsibility for working with the Defense Industrial Base, one of the 18 critical infrastructure categories. And we're working closely with DHS now to look at how the capabilities of the Department can be brought to bear to support DHS in protection of other critical infrastructure. And as you know, but I just want to have on the record, the President does have emergency authority to direct DOD to defend the nation as part of the defense support to civil authorities against a cyber or any other attack. We are in internal conversations in the administration now about how to do that more effectively and whether new authorities and legislation is needed, and look forward to joining your subcommittee, the other emerging threats and capability subcommittee, in a couple of weeks with General Alexander to discuss.
Thank you. Well, I'm encouraged by that answer, and also both of you. I want to thank you for your testimony, and I look forward to following up, particularly on the directed energy issue as well. As I've often said, with the growing threats that the nation faces from ballistic missile issues, we're not adequately going to be able to defend the nation with kinetic weapons alone. The game changer will really come through directed energy, and the more we can do to support that work, the better. So thank you both for your testimony and your work, and with that, I yield back.
I just want to echo what Mr. Langevin just said. Great comments. Mr. Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Miller, first question is for you. You may not be able to answer it. It may make you uncomfortable. But this gets back to South Korea. And we know that the conservative politicians there have for some time wanted to reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons to the peninsula. So we know recent DPRK actions haven't driven that desire out of the blue from some elements of South Korean politics. But I guess what is shocking to me is that a White House official both believes that we would reintroduce and encourages such a request of tactical peninsula. So my question is, what was he thinking?
Obviously, I can't answer that first person. I did have a chance to talk to Gary Seymour, and I can tell you that he is fully on board with the clarification that was issued, and he was fully on board with the fact that I had come in and intended to also say and make absolutely clear that the U.S. nuclear umbrella continues to extend to South Korea, and that neither side believes that that requires the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons on the peninsula. I tell you that he's 100% behind what the clarification of this policy is.
Did anybody tell Seymour he should say less? Because he ought to. Back to something you might be able to answer directly, speaking for yourself. It has to do with the Global Threat Reduction Initiative. The O10 appropriation was over $300 million. The FY11 request was over $550 million. And obviously this increase was for funding reflects the administration's success in securing promises from former Soviet bloc countries to remove and return highly enriched uranium by 2012. But we're in this continuing resolution world right now, and I would like you, if you can, help us understand what would happen to our efforts in Belarus and Poland, Vietnam, and other countries, and our ability to follow through on these 2012 commitments and help them follow through on these 2012 commitments if, in fact, we ended up with something less than what the administration requested for 2011.
Mr. Larson, we would have to make some very, very difficult choices. What I would like to do, if I can, is take this for the record and come back and give you specific answers, given that we are partway through the year in execution at a lower level than we had hoped. And I can like to describe what have been the effects so far, and then what would be the consequences if it continued for the duration of the year. I can give some general comments, but I think it'd be preferable to give details on it, and I'd be happy to do so on a country-by-country basis and to answer very swiftly.
That'd be great, and that'd be very helpful. And I think it's because it's not so much that this is this administration's policy. It's just a generally good idea to get to these countries and get our hands on this HEU, get it behind a good lock, and then destroy it. And I'm very concerned we're going to be able to do that, much less than what happens to the 012 request as we move forward in the appropriations process. General Kaler, again, congratulations. It's been an exciting 30 days for you, I'm sure. But something that we've on this committee have considered over the last several years, and Mr. Chairman, and I was going to ask Ranking Member too, we might want to either do a hearing or do something in a different setting on space situational awareness. We've been tracking that and pressing that for the last several years for a lot of reasons. But what are the most important steps, given what's in the budget for 012, what are the most important steps that you can tell us about here that you're taking with regards to space situational awareness?
Congressman, there are two critical components that are continued in this budget that's before you today that will contribute to space situational awareness. One is a way to better fuse the existing data from the existing sensors, make better use of the sensors that we have, and bring that information together out at Vandenberg in what is our Joint Space Operations Center. At the same time as we go down that road, I think we have a great opportunity here to look very carefully with our allies and commercial partners and others to see how they can continue to contribute to that pool of data and our overall understanding of what's there. Over the last year or almost two now, STRATCOM has been pursuing a program that was actually recommended by Congress. It was originally called the Commercial and Foreign Entities Program. What that has resulted in now is a much better way to share situational information with other entities, to include commercial partners that have now signed up and are much more freely providing information about their platforms. So that frees up our sensors and our computing power to go after things that maybe we don't know as much about. So that's very helpful. So it's how the data is exposed, how we make use of it, and how we include partners in all of that, I think, is something that is critically important and something that we will need to continue to push. Some of that is contained in this budget. The other thing is sensors. Mm-hmm. Even with sharing other information and even with the better use of the sensors we have, we will need some sensors positioned in other places, and that is contained, preliminaries are contained in the budget as well. So those two things are in the budget. They're important, both of those to us, and overall, as I think you're right, the issue of situational awareness for space is very high on our priority list. And by the way, it is for cyberspace as well, and it is not unlike the same issues that we are working for space. So cyber situational awareness, I think if General Alexander was here from Cybercom, he would leap up at this point and say same for cyberspace, because that is a high priority for us in both of these places.
Yeah, and just quickly, I gather from your answer that in fact we could have a much more complex conversation about this, perhaps in a different setting. So,
Yes, sir.
thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment on space situational awareness. In fact, this subcommittee has been working on issues of having 101 sessions, if you will, briefings that are not in the context of committee hearings for the purposes of really just straight education and subject matter information for the members. And Mr. Larson, I'm very proud to say you get a gold star. I think you've been in probably the best attendance of anybody, and I appreciate that. We have a space situation.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, after last year's markup, I made a commitment to you that I would. So
there you go. Wonderful. The space is next Friday, so we will be. So I'm certain your star will not diminish. I look forward to there. And Dr. Keith Payne, who we have next, and Dr. Roberts have both presented in those, and we've greatly appreciated their participation. Gentlemen, we're going to end here, but I'm going to give you an opportunity if there's anything that you'd like to say in closing or to clarify in the discussion. I want to give you the opportunity to add anything to your comments.
I'll say three things very quickly. First, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today and to your 101 sessions, and look forward to having our people continue those, and want to be available to answer any additional questions that you and the subcommittee or larger committee have as well. Second, I look forward to coming back specifically for a classified discussion on hedge and what our thinking is in that regard. We had by chance, bumped into the combatant commander for Northern Command in the anteroom, and I think we're well aligned on having the internal conversations closed down that we need to move forward there. And third, I want to thank you and the subcommittee committee for support of both sides of President Obama's vision, including the arms control side, and also including the investments. And again, say that it's critical to this administration that we get the funding necessary to support our strategic nuclear delivery systems, and again, DoD speaking for a DOE funding line, the funding for NNSA to continue its nonproliferation and its weapons work as well for FY11. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, just let me add my thanks. We know that the subcommittee has a lot of issues on its plate, and we're pledged to come back at any time that you want to continue these discussions further. And typically, combatant commanders don't say much about investment and needs to support budgets, but I must add my voice to Dr. Miller here. In the first 30 days, I have told my staff that what I wanted to do was get all the way around the nuclear weapons complex. I didn't make it. I got about half of the way through, but I'll get through the rest of it within the next couple of weeks. And I must say that my assessment is that the investment that is planned for them is definitely needed, and it underpins all of our other deterrence activities. If the weapons are not safe and reliable, safe and effective and secure, I think we don't have a leg to stand on. So I would encourage support for that part of the investment as well, even though that's not directly in our portfolio.
General, thank you for those comments. Thank you both. Thank you for your service. And then we'll now go to our second panel, which will be Dr. Bill Perry and Dr. Keith Payne. Gentlemen, while you're getting situated, let me begin my welcome to you. I want to provide you a warm welcome to Dr. Perry and Dr. Payne. As I mentioned earlier, I believe that the committee's oversight is further enhanced through additional perspectives outside of the traditional Pentagon witnesses that we usually hear from. Therefore, I have asked Dr. Bill Perry and Dr. Jim Schlesinger, the Chairman and Vice Chairman of the U.S. Strategic Posture Commission, to provide their views. Dr. Schlesinger, as I stated earlier, was unable to join us today, and I appreciate Dr. Keith Payne filling in for him, and greatly appreciate your also participation, as we mentioned prior in our 101 sessions where the committee is doing an overview of the subject matter. Dr. Perry, I greatly appreciate you being here and all of your service and insight. We look forward to your statement, and I'll recognize you now. Dr. Perry, they're going to turn your microphone on here, I believe.
In 2009, the Congress appointed our Bipartisan Commission. We met for a year, and we ended up with a report. We have reported about a year ago to the Congress on that report. It was a bipartisan commission and ended up with, amazingly, a consensus report with only one exception that had to do with the CTBT treaty. I reviewed the statement that I made to Congress last year, and I stand by that statement. And my written testimony reflects that fact with a few updates, and the updates primarily reflect the new events, and most notably the nuclear posture review, which is finished since then. So in my oral statement, I'm only going to highlight a few of the important points. First is that the threat has indeed changed since the Cold War, with a much less risk of a nuclear exchange, but a greater risk of nuclear terrorism. Therefore, to safeguard our security, we must continue to support the military programs that maintain an adequate deterrence force. At the same time, we need to support those programs that guard us against nuclear terrorism. They fall into two categories, basically military programs, of which the BMD program is the primary example, and non-military programs, which are international in nature, which prevent proliferation. Considering those two different kinds of programs, when I was the Secretary of Defense, I referred to those as the need to lead but hedge. Lead in the international programs that prevented proliferation, but hedging by maintaining an adequate deterrence in case the stopping proliferation failed. The leading has been supported really by the last 5 administrations through treaties. The START Treaty, the INF Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Moscow Treaty, and most recently the New START Treaty. The deterrence, which is the hedge part of that, was a major subject of the report we wrote. We recommended how to maintain the deterrence in the future. I am happy to report that in my judgment, the nuclear posture review largely accepted the recommendations that we made in our report. We argued that that as a matter of policy, we should clarify how we're going to use nuclear weapons. The nuclear posture review used somewhat different language than we used, but nevertheless did have an important clarification. And it also, as we recommended, made strong assurances to our allies. Secondly, we argued strongly that we should maintain the safety, security, reliability, and effectiveness of our deterrence force. Do that through maintaining a robust 3 laboratories, through maintaining a stockpile stewardship program, a life extension program, and undertake the program to make a transformation of our 2 facilities at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge. One of them is plutonium, the other is uranium. All of those are in the nuclear posture review, and all of them have been funded. So I'm quite pleased with how the follow-up on our treaty there. In terms of the leading, we recommended strongly actions to reverse proliferation in North Korea and Iran, I'm sorry to report nothing useful has happened in either of those cases. They still maintain threats, I would say greater threats than at the time we wrote our report. We recommended that there be a arms treaty with Russia with modest reductions, and the New START treaty essentially was compatible with what we had recommended there. We then also said that beyond that, we should consider follow-on treaties which dealt specifically with the danger of tactical nuclear weapons. We recommended a strong strategic dialogue with Russia and other nuclear powers. That has gotten underway. We recommended continuing maintaining the strength of the threat reduction program. On the nature of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, we had a split report on that. Half of us recommending in favor of doing it, half of us recommending against it, but all of us recommending steps that the Senate should take to reconsider the treaty. And finally, we recommended the strengthening of the International Atomic Energy Agency and adding to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty the additional protocols to strengthen them. Mr. Chairman, that summarizes briefly what I thought were the highlights of the report and how it compared to the Nuclear Posture Review. My bottom line is I am very pleased that the Nuclear Posture Review was I think, quite compatible with the recommendations that we made, with only a few minor exceptions.
Thank you, Dr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be here today, particularly in the company of Secretary Perry, who did such a wonderful job leading the commission. So thank you, sir. And as you noted, Mr. Chairman, I'm pinch hitting for Dr. Schlesinger today.
Dr. Payne, could you move your microphone in front of you, please?
Thank you. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, I'm pinch hitting for Dr. Schlesinger today. I know we all wish he could be here, and we all wish him the very best. I would like to make a brief opening remark and then submit the article from which I drew those remarks for the record. I'll take just a moment to identify a few of the Commission's basic recommendations and then identify the potential challenges to the U.S. strategic nuclear force posture as I see them. The Bipartisan Congressional Strategic Posture Commission offered numerous recommendations to reduce what we called the nuclear danger. For example, to reduce the nuclear danger, the Commission recommended a conscious effort to balance diplomatic measures to reduce the number of nuclear weapons with the necessary measures to deter attacks and to assure allies of their security. And despite the occasional friction between U.S. diplomatic and deterrence efforts, Republican and Democratic administrations for 5 decades have sought just such a balance. The Commission also emphasized that the United States must maintain a viable nuclear arsenal for the indefinite future to support the national goals of deterrence and assurance. The Commission did not try to identify the minimum number of nuclear weapons necessary for deterrence and assurance. This omission was not a mistake. It was in recognition of the fact that these force requirements can change rapidly because they are driven by many fluid factors. Rather than selecting an inherently transient right number of nuclear weapons, the Commission highlighted the need for a flexible and resilient force posture to support deterrence and assurance across a shifting landscape of threats and contexts. We noted in particular that the importance of flexibility and resilience in the force posture will increase as U.S. forces decline in numbers. This emphasis on the need for flexibility and resilience in our force structure is the primary reason the Commission recommended that the Administration maintain the strategic triad of bombers, ICBMs, and sea-based missiles. Finally, in recognition of the fact that deterrence may prove unreliable, the Commission also concluded that the United States must design its strategic forces not only for deterrence, but also to help defend against an attack if deterrence fails. This defensive goal includes a requirement for missile defense against regional aggressors and limited long-range missile threats. We specifically urge that U.S. defenses against long-range missiles become capable against more complex, limited threats as they mature. In light of these Commission recommendations, my foremost concern is that U.S. nuclear policy appears to be departing from a balance between diplomatic and deterrence measures to reduce the nuclear danger. Specifically, the goal of nuclear reductions appears to have been given precedence, and the resultant imbalance could undermine our future capabilities to deter, to assure, and to defend. What's the basis for my concern? The 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, a highly commendable report in many respects, for the first time places atop the U.S. nuclear agenda international nonproliferation efforts as a critical element of our effort to move toward a world free of nuclear weapons. And that's quoting from the NPR. This prioritization appears self-consciously to depart from the carefully balanced dual tracks of the past 50 years. Administration assurances that the U.S. will maintain an effective nuclear deterrent certainly are welcome. But at the end of the day, if the top U.S. policy priority is international nonproliferation efforts and movement toward nuclear zero, there will be unavoidable trade-offs made at the expense of the U.S. forces important for deterrence, assurance, and defense. This is not an academic concern over a few policy words. The administration links qualitative limits and numeric reductions in U.S. nuclear forces to progress in nonproliferation and the movement toward nuclear zero. Qualitative limitations and further reductions in our forces, however, can reduce their flexibility and their resilience, undermining our national goals of deterrence and assurance. This is the trade-off that continues to need careful balance. And the Commission specifically cautioned against pursuing nuclear reductions at the expense of the resilience of our forces, in part because policies that undermine credible deterrence and assurance could actually provoke nuclear proliferation, not prevent it. U.S. defensive programs may also be undermined by the administration's self-described nuclear policy agenda. Russian officials and some American commentators now claim that qualitative and quantitative restraints on U.S. strategic defenses are necessary for any further negotiated nuclear reductions. With international nonproliferation efforts and movement toward nuclear zero at the top of the U.S. nuclear agenda, as defined in the Nuclear Posture Review, the pursuit of nuclear reductions at the expense of U.S. missile defenses could ultimately be deemed an acceptable trade-off. That certainly is the Russian demand. My final related concern is the possibility that new policy guidance could attempt to drive deep reductions in U.S. forces by redefining deterrence in minimalist terms, thereby lowering the force requirements deemed adequate for deterrence. For over 5 decades, Republican and Democratic administrations have consistently rejected minimum deterrence as inadequate and dangerous. Yet many proponents of nuclear zero now again advocate new presidential guidance that adopts minimum deterrence as a way to justify deep reductions in U.S. nuclear forces. Adopting a minimum definition of deterrence may help to justify the elimination of the triad and U.S. nuclear reductions down to 500 weapons. But it would do so at the expense of the flexibility and resilience and thus the effectiveness of our forces for deterrence and assurance. Again, the Commission specifically cautioned against such nuclear reductions and emphasized that new presidential guidance should, and I quote, be informed by assessments of what is needed for deterrence and assurance. Any new guidance that adopts minimum deterrence could easily increase the nuclear danger by undermining credible U.S. deterrence and by pushing friends and allies toward nuclear proliferation. In summary, I'm concerned about the apparent imbalance in the administration's announced nuclear agenda and the possibility that new policy guidance may adopt long-rejected minimum deterrence standards as a route to deep nuclear reductions. The Commission's unanimous recommendations for 1, a balance in priorities, 2, the maintenance of a flexible and resilient strategic force posture, and 3, improving U.S. strategic defensive capabilities, indeed against missile threats of all ranges, those recommendations, I believe, remain useful and pertinent. Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for your comments and for your input. This is very helpful as we take in consideration the prior testimony to get your perspective. Dr. Perry, I want to again commend you for the Strategic Posture Commission. Everyone looks to the report from that commission as a great perspective on both the policy issues that we need to look for in decision making, but also some of the substantive guidance, I think that you are absolutely correct, went into the NPR and further into START. I think it's a great perspective for us to continue to look to. I have basically two questions that have a couple multiple parts. I'm going to ask you the first one with a couple parts to it. But the first is about overall general cuts. The second is on the tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. So the first question is, could you please describe in more detail the guidance that would have to be rewritten to warrant deeper cuts in our nuclear arsenal? What are some of the consequences or dangers associated with downgrading our deterrence requirements? Does this mean downgrading from a counterforce to a countervailing strategy? Could such a move hurt the credibility and flexibility of our deterrent? Well, that would be the first question, and I'll give you both an opportunity to answer, and then I'd like to discuss the technical weapons in Europe. Mr. Perry, Dr. Perry.
You wanted to do the first question
If
first.
you would, yes.
Yeah. My present view, Mr. Chairman, is that our cuts for the foreseeable future should be aligned with the cuts made by Russia. And if they are willing to go to deeper cuts, we should be willing to go to deeper cuts as well. That will be true up until such time as those cuts begin to approach the level of the other nuclear powers. That's a short answer to the question.
Excellent. Dr. Payne?
Thank you. According to official unclassified and declassified reports, there are different general categories of opponents' targets that the U.S. tries to hold at risk for deterrence purposes. Categories are nuclear forces, leadership, other military capabilities, and war-supporting industrial and economic facilities, according to the unclassified official government statements to that effect. Over time, as the Commission noted, presidential guidance has adjusted U.S. emphasis on these categories, which can then change the numbers and types of weapons the military requires to fulfill that guidance. In theory, to get to low force requirements, new guidance could lower the force standards deemed adequate for deterrence. New guidance could simply eliminate nuclear requirements to hold one or more of those categories of targets that I identified at risk for deterrence purposes. We've seen something like this in the past. In the 1960s, Secretary of Defense McNamara declared that U.S. deterrent requirements could be met by threatening 25% of the Soviet population and 50% of the Soviet industrial base. That was the assured destruction capability that was deemed adequate for deterrence. And Secretary McNamara subsequently said that one of the reasons for choosing that type of threat as a declaratory policy was because it allowed him to hold numbers of forces very low, because the lethality of nuclear weapons is such that it's not a large number of nuclear weapons necessary to hold those kind of targets at risk, population and industry. So some have now suggested going back to a McNamara-type assured destruction threat, deterrent threat, with an emphasis on only a few industrial-type targets as the way to get numbers of force requirements, the number of forces and the requirements down. For 5 decades, I should note that no Republican or Democratic administration has accepted that kind of minimum deterrence standard for U.S. forces, and for very good reasons. The primary reason is because revising the U.S. definition of requirements down for deterrence doesn't mean that the actual requirements for deterrence go down. The actual deterrence requirements are driven by what our opponents think, not by our goal to reduce numbers. I think Harold Brown, put it best when he said, for deterrence to prevent war as effectively as possible, it's critical that the United States can threaten what the opponents value, wherever that leads us. So with that, I note that there are at least a handful of fundamental reasons for rejecting any efforts to go back to a minimum deterrence definition of force requirements. And each of these reasons follows because those kind of force requirements, minimum deterrence force requirements, create an inflexible straitjacket for the President. But one, going down to very low numbers associated with minimum deterrence is unlikely to be credible to deter attacks on us or our allies, at least on some occasions. Enemies may not believe that threat on occasion, or that threat may not be suitable to address what the opponent actually values on other occasions, violating Harold Brown's dictum. In either case, minimum deterrence will fail to prevent war. Two, minimum deterrence standards will undercut our ability to assure our allies and friends, and it will lead some of them to seek their own independent nuclear capabilities, i.e., it's likely to promote nuclear proliferation. Three, these types of minimum force standards associated with minimum deterrence will also ease the problems for opponents who seek to counter or get around our deterrence strategies. They're actually likely to encourage challenges to deterrence. Four, a minimum deterrence that focuses on population and civilians, civilian centers, are both illegal and immoral as a targeting policy. We cannot intentionally threaten civilian populations and targets for deterrence purposes. And lastly, minimum deterrence standards offer little flexibility or resilience so that when the future unfolds in a threatening fashion, we don't have the flexibility or the resilience to respond as necessary to deter war and to assure our allies. It's basically those reasons that I've just identified, those handful of reasons, why no Democratic or Republican administration for 5 decades has accepted a minimum deterrence approach to force sizing.
Mr. Chairman, if I may comment on that. My recommendation was to continue to reduce numbers compatible with those of Russia. The question of deterrence has to first be said, one has to first ask, whom are we deterring? Russia, I would argue the answer is Russia, because all other cases are lesser included cases at this time. At the present numbers and foreseeable numbers in the future, Russia is the only one that has enough nuclear weapons to be an issue here. And the next question is deterring what? Russia does not have a conventional capability today capable of threatening either the United States or Europe. So all we can be talking about is deterring Russia's nuclear weapons. Therefore, that's why my answer, assuming those points, my answer talked about making the reductions in terms of bilateral reductions with Russia. And that was the point. This is the background for that point.
Turning then to my second question, and Dr. Perry, that's a great transition to my second question. What we have learned today in our discussion is that NATO is currently undertaking a deterrence review. And in that deterrence review, they'll be looking at all components of NATO's presence, both our nuclear capability, our missile defense capability, and conventional. It is a concern that the deterrence review proceed in context, as you said, Dr. Perry, to what is being deterred, that being Russia and, of course, their significant nuclear arsenal. There is concern that there might be a recommendation in the deterrence review for a reduction in the U.S. nuclear force presence in Europe without achieving concessions from Russia of the number of tactical nuclear weapons that it currently has. For purposes of discussion, we know that they have an excess of 3,800. Perhaps they have as many as 5,000. The U.S. has a very minimal number in conjunction with our NATO commitment. Do you think it would be wrong for us to do that? Because it would seem to me that if there's going to be corresponding reductions, that we should be seeking reductions from the Russians, and I think that's certainly the guidance that the Senate had given in adopting New START. I'd like both of your thoughts, Dr. Perry.
I'd like to give you a two-pronged answer to that question. First of all, I do not think we need nuclear weapons in Europe to deter Russia from an attack, or any other country from an attack on Europe. The nuclear weapons we have on our submarines, for example, are perfectly adequate providing that deterrence. But there is a substantial political issue involved. And the political issue, the reason we have nuclear weapons in Europe in the first place is not because the rest of our weapons are not capable of deterrence, but because during the Cold War at least, our allies in Europe felt more assured when we had nuclear weapons in Europe. That's why they were deployed there in the first place. Today, the issue is a little different. The issue is the Russians, in the meantime, have built a large number of nuclear weapons, and we keep our nuclear weapons there as somewhat of a political leverage for dealing with an ultimate treaty in which we may get Russia and the United States to eliminate tactical nuclear weapons. My own view is it would be desirable if both the United States and Russia would eliminate tactical nuclear weapons, but I see it very difficult to arrive at that conclusion if we were simply to eliminate all of our tactical nuclear weapons unilaterally.
Thank you. Dr. Payne.
Thank you. The Russian position certainly is that all U.S. tactical nuclear weapons must be returned to the United States before they will engage in negotiations on tactical nuclear weapons. I see some real problems with that, because if they're withdrawn now back to U.S. territory, hard to imagine them ever going back. And even if U.S. tactical nuclear weapons aren't necessary to deter Russia now, we don't know that the future is going to be so friendly. And so I'm very concerned about the idea of deciding that our tactical nuclear weapons serve no deterrence role now, therefore we can bring them back, because the future has a way of turning out in some ways darker than we anticipate on many occasions. And I think we need that flexibility to be able to be prepared for future events that may be less happy than we would otherwise expect. The second point is that in addition to we may need them in for deterrence purposes in the future, is that many of our allies see our nuclear weapons there as important for their assurance. It's what in some cases helps to keep them from deciding they'll pursue an alternative to extended nuclear deterrence. And therefore, this isn't just a deterrence issue. In fact, I think it's primarily at the present time an issue of how do you assure allies so they themselves remain comfortable within the alliance and in a non-nuclear status. And we know, because before the Commission, a number of allies we had a chance to speak with said, these weapons in Europe are important to us for the demonstration of extended deterrence. So I'd be very reluctant to see the U.S. do anything unilaterally along those lines.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regard to minimum deterrence, Dr. Payne, would you include the current administration as one of those who's rejected minimum deterrence?
Yes.
Thank you. I'd also note in your testimony, you talked about the Governor Tokyo arguing at some point that Japan may look to its own independent nuclear deterrent. I was in Japan a few years ago on a CODEL and having lunch with some folks from the Diet, and this was at least 3 years ago, and they were arguing then that they should have an independent nuclear deterrent. There are some folks in Japan who believe they ought to have an independent nuclear deterrent, regardless of who the administration is, and so, and regardless of assurances that we have about extended deterrence, and for Asia. So I just think that's just some context here. But there are some things about the NPR that I know you all looked at, and I'd like to get your views both on the NPR's negative assurance policy, where the administration did make a slight, an adjustment on the negative assurance policy, and I'd like to first Dr. Perry and then Dr. Payne get your thoughts on the advantages of this negative assurance policy, how you see it playing, how has it played out, has it not played out at all, and maybe perhaps the disadvantages of what the current negative assurance policy is. Dr. Perry, could you start?
The short answer is I thought that the Nuclear Posture Review's negative assurance policy was a positive step forward.
Do you have a longer answer? We're not used to short answers around here. I'm sorry. You know how it is.
I think it's important that one of the main points of the negative assurance policy is to have the minimum incentive for other nations to build nuclear weapons. A negative assurance policy doesn't guarantee that, but it is a useful step in that direction. And so that is why I review this as a positive step forward. So basically, I'm in favor of that. I thought we had a pretty good negative assurance policy before. I think it's some improvement.
Dr. Payne. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Perry.
I also supported the language that the Commission put out with regard to negative assurance policies, and I was glad to see that the NPR didn't vary from that very much. The changes in the NPR with regard to the negative assurance policies are, I think, minor, and in fact, when Secretary Clinton later amplified it by saying, if BW is ever used against the United States, all bets are on the table, I thought that was a useful elaboration. And so with that type of understanding, I thought the changes were minimal, and I thought that was a good thing.
Yeah, okay. With regards to, and Dr. Payne, this gets to your point perhaps, well, one of your points in your testimony, oral and written, is that the President stated that the role of nuclear weapons will be reduced in U.S. national security policy, and to that end, the NPR declares that non-nuclear elements will take on a greater share of the deterrence burden. Should we interpret that as a desire to substitute conventional for nuclear capabilities and deterrence?
Well, the 2001 Nuclear Posture Review said exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. So this wasn't a great departure from what had been set up before.
Sounds like it was no departure.
In that case, there was no departure, sir. I agreed with that at the time, so I, again, didn't have any challenge whatsoever to that kind of statement in the Nuclear Posture Review. Where deterrence can be serviced by conventional forces, we should certainly have the conventional forces available to do just that.
So then how would that square with, I guess I gathered from your written and oral testimony that this turning down the temperature or moving away from a nuclear deterrence was a bad thing, and it might be a bad thing. I'm just trying to square that with your testimony.
No, fair enough, sir. The point I was making isn't that moving towards conventional forces for deterrence when possible is the wrong way to go. I think that's the right way to go. The point that I was making with regard to the NPR statement was the NPR language that says moving towards international non-proliferation goals as a step towards nuclear zero is now the highest priority. It's the top priority. That's what the NPR says. Whereas in the past, the United States, every Democratic and Republican administration has balanced those priorities. So it wasn't I don't have a concern that we move towards conventional deterrence when that fits and when that's suitable and when we can get appropriate deterrent effect from conventional forces. My concern is that the trade-offs that will have to be made if the top priority is in fact toward nuclear zero, international non-proliferations moving towards nuclear zero, because there will be trade-offs made with regard to our assurance, our deterrence, and our defensive capabilities if that's the operative top priority. That's my concern.
Okay. Dr. Perry, obviously you've been chewing on this question longer than I have, certainly. Do you have a response to Dr. Payne's comments with regards to this?
I generally agree with Dr. Payne's comments on there. I might say that the main subject of dialogue, even controversy within the Commission, was not whether there should be a balance. Everybody agreed there should be a balance. We just how to weigh that balance. And some members favored weighing the proliferation issues more strongly than the deterrence issues and vice versa. And that had to do with whether they thought, which they thought was the more pressing threat to the United States.
Yeah.
But they all agreed, I think we all agreed on the importance of having a balance.
Yeah, great. All right. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to end with one question that is really asking both of you for a commercial. The Commission made recommendations about the investment into our nuclear infrastructure and NNSA. Some of that investment is at risk in this discussion that we're having on budget cuts nationally. As we look to the continuing resolution process where we have not yet funded the government for this year, there are many reductions that are hitting areas that they should not. For example, our national security and national defense. Since we've had deferred maintenance, a long period of time where we did not put the money in that we should have, we're now in a situation where we have to put more money in, and some are seeing that money as huge increases that perhaps we could find savings in. I'd love just if each of you could pause for a moment and give us some guidance, give Congress some guidance as to how important that funding is for NNSA, what you saw, Dr. Perry, in the Commission of our disinvestment, and Dr. Payne, what you see as the threat if we don't respond. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll speak for myself first, but I really think I am speaking for the Commission when I say this, which is that we regarded it extremely important to maintain a robust program at all three nuclear laboratories, the hiring and retaining of key people, the supporting of the stockpile stewardship program, the supporting of the life extension program. Beyond that, we believe that the plutonium facilities at Los Alamos ought to be renewed, and that the uranium facilities at Oak Ridge ought to be renewed. In the report, if my memory is right, we said that those could be done sequentially, in which case the plutonium should have the first priority and the uranium should be done after that. But we did argue that both of them should be renewed. I would defer to Dr. Payne.
This, again, is another area where the Commission was unanimous in the support for essentially fixing the problems that the NNSA confronts. You mentioned the commercial, Chairman Turner. It's like the old commercial, you either pay me now or pay me more later. I think our recommendation was to do it now as opposed to having to pay more later. I was encouraged to see the letter from the three lab directors who said that they thought the budgets that came out of the 1251 report and the administration's commitment were quite acceptable to fulfill those goals and to fix the problem. So I would hate to see, and I'm sure Secretary Perry would hate to see, movement away from that solution that we seems like we almost have in hand for that problem. The only other point I would add, and the Commission report noted this a bit as well, is we also have industrial infrastructure challenges in front of us. Just making sure that the United States, for example, can produce large solid rocket motors, I think is a very important goal, and it's something that's going to need attention in the near future. So there are NNSA challenges, but there are also industrial challenges that need to be tended to.
Gentlemen, with that, I'll ask if you have any closing comments.
I do not. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I just have one, and I'll make it short, and that goes back to Congressman Larson's question. Do I believe that this administration pursues a minimum deterrence policy? And I said no. I don't believe this administration pursues a minimum deterrence policy. The concern that I reflected in my remarks is, my fear is that given the priorities identified in the NPR, we could see that coming. And I would hope that we would pay great attention to avoid that, as every past Republican and Democratic administration has avoided it.
Dr. Payne, Dr. Perry, thank you so much. Thank you for all your contribution. And Dr. Perry, I must tell you that Carrie Bingen, our professional staff member, had just commented that she could listen to you for hours, and I know we all could, and we would learn so much. So thank you for coming and participating, and thank you for your record. Very good.